But I will say, typically when, I ask you these questions, like common courtesy would be to ask me back what my answer is. But since you never fucking do that, you don't care about me. Welcome to another episode of the Nerds You're Looking For podcast, a nerd culture podcast that discusses nerddom through various segments. My name is Tyler Hunt, and I'm here with my co-host, as always, Pat Kuhn. How's it going, man?
It's good. I actually, right off the bat, have to admit to something that I'm not very proud of. I may have to turn in my movie nerd membership card after I admit this, but I actually didn't watch the Oscars live this year. I'm pretty embarrassed about it. Yeah. So, we've talked about this before. Tyler has been a cord cutter for a long time now. And like Movie Pass, it took me a while to catch up, get on his level, when it came to the cord cutting. And so I've been doing that for about 2 years now. And I think it was like right before the Oscars, 2 years ago, we actually decided to cut the cord, and we were able to figure out a way to watch the Oscars 2 years ago. But this year I was pretty determined. I was like, I'm going to figure it out. I have a digital antenna. Like, for whatever reason, ABC is really hard to get where we live, like on a digital antenna. But I was like, I'm going to move it around and find a signal, and we're going to be good. And then we'll have like Reddit as a backup plan to like live stream it from Reddit or something as a backup plan. Neither one of those plans worked. Like, we could find a link for it because I couldn't get the digital antenna to work at all. And then we found a link for it, and we would watch like 30 seconds and that link would get shut down. And then I would spend the next 5-10 minutes looking for another one, and then 30 seconds, and then it would get shut down too. So after about 30-40 minutes of doing that and missing a good chunk of the show, we just decided to give up on it. And I watched it like the first thing the next morning on Hulu. So I was a little embarrassed about that, being the big movie nerd that I am. But I watched it, and I just had to stay off Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff Sunday night.
Yeah, I did watch it live, and I was able to get it with my digital antenna, and I watched all of it up until the good stuff, until the good categories. And I was like, I gotta go to bed because I had to catch a flight that next morning and had to be up at like 5 a.m. for it. So, with it, yeah, that's the one thing that sucks about being on Eastern time now, is that the Oscars, I didn't end up going to bed till like midnight, and I didn't even stay up for all of it. So, yeah, it was a tough decision to make, but I caught up the next morning on the categories I missed. I actually don't have any of the Oscar results in nerd news. I kept it pretty simple this week. So was there anything that happened that surprised you the most?
Not really. I mean, I was happy that Shape of Water won for Best Picture. I didn't think, because that movie is so weird, I didn't think that it really had a legitimate chance to win. So I was pretty happy about that. I was happy, even though I was hoping that The Big Sick would win. I was happy that Jordan Peele won for Get Out. For writing, I was pretty happy about that. One of those two needed to win for me to be happy. So, I was definitely happy about that. I was kind of surprised that Call Me By Your Name didn't win more. I know it won a couple of things. I was surprised it didn't win more. And of course, I was disappointed that War for the Planet of the Apes didn't win, but I kind of expected that.
Yeah. I thought you'd say you were disappointed Boss Baby didn't get Best Animated Feature since you hate Coco so much.
I don't hate Coco. I actually am going to get that on Blu-ray. So, I don't necessarily hate it. And like I've said before, and I know you're just busting my balls, but I hope that Coco kind of follows a similar path to Moana, because I wasn't that impressed with that movie. And I will share kind of a funny story. So, Friday, I had to stream a little bit earlier than I normally do. Like, I basically got home from work and I streamed for about an hour after I got home from work because we actually went out. My wife and I went to my sister-in-law's house because they were having like a gender reveal party thing, because that's a thing now. And so I was actually at their house and with my in-laws and whatnot, and they had Moana on the TV. And as soon as I got there, I was like, "Ooh, Moana!" And I sat in there and watched a little bit of it. So I kind of hope that Coco follows a similar path as Moana, because, like I said, I didn't really particularly like that movie the first time I saw it.
Yeah, it's funny. The next morning, because I've been very vocal with my thoughts on Shape of Water and the fact that I love 75% of that movie. And, you know, at the end of the day, like, I'm pretty excited that it won Best Picture, because movies like that don't typically win. And obviously both of us are huge Guillermo del Toro fans, so it's pretty awesome to see him pick up Best Director and his movie get Best Picture. But the next morning I got lots of texts from some of my buddies and some of my coworkers like, "Oh, Shape of Water won. I bet that pissed you off, like the fish kick movie." And I mean, at the end of the day, like, you know, that movie, like, I'm going to buy it on Blu-ray. Like, I liked it enough for that. It's just, I mean, we said it during our top 10, I think our retrospective for 2017. It's, you know, everything's fine and good until she starts fucking the fish.
Yeah.
I know that it's a metaphor for other things, and that movie's not like all that it appears to be, but at the end of the day, that thing's a wild animal and she fucks it. So, spin it whatever way you want. That's what happens in that movie. But all of that set aside, like, you know, it is a beautifully shot movie, a beautifully written movie. And, obviously Three Billboards was the favorite, and I love that movie as well and like that movie better than Shape of Water, but by no means was I disappointed that Shape of Water won.
Yeah, every time that me and my wife have a conversation about Shape of Water, she always like starts laughing, and I assume that she's laughing about her fucking the fish, but it turns out at the very end, she thinks it would be funny if he signed eggs again. Like at the very end when they're kind of like talking, she thinks it's like the funniest thing if the fish guy signed eggs to her. Like that's the only thing he learned this whole time was how to sign eggs. For whatever reason, my wife thinks that would be hilarious. But yeah, I'm happy that Shape of Water won, but I think Three Billboards is probably more deserving.
Yeah, but I mean, Three Billboards still won what? Best Supporting Actor and Best Actress. So, you know, I'm sure that they'll take it.
Oh yeah, for sure. All right. So our first segment, we break up each one of these episodes into different segments, and we kind of like to just check in with each other at the very beginning. We call it what we're into. So what are you into this week?
My wife and I went to see Strangers 2 last night. So, you know, if you're listening to this episode, you probably saw that we'll be reviewing Jessica Jones season 2 later in this episode. But, you know, her and I took some time out of that task of watching 13 episodes in a weekend to go see a movie. And we decided on Strangers 2, even though there were a couple other things out as well. And the original Strangers movie kind of came and went for me. It wasn't anything that really resonated, but it did strike a chord for a lot of people, apparently. I guess part of its horror that people really liked was the aspect that it was completely random. And if I remember correctly, like one of the big lines from the trailer for that movie was, I think Liv Tyler's character maybe asks, "Why are you doing this?" And one of the female killers says, "Because you were home." And I think that was part of the thrill factor for a lot of people, was that this was completely random. And obviously it also played on the based on a true story type element. So it just hit a lot of the right notes for a lot of people that are going to see horror movies. And honestly, for me, since it did so well and it kind of does have a little bit of a cult following, it's hard to believe that it took 10 years to make this movie, because that first one came out in 2008. With that being said, and since it took 10 years for this movie to be made, it seems like maybe they put 20 minutes-ish into pre-production for the movie and spent about half a day shooting it, because it's basically the same movie as the first Strangers, except this time it's a family of 4 in a mostly abandoned trailer park, and they're being hunted by what I assume is the 3 same killers from the first movie. This movie is a quick hour and 25 minutes, And the script to this film is so incredibly shallow that I can't imagine that much effort was put into getting this movie made or, putting it together once it was greenlit. So the one thing I will say that I appreciate about the short runtime is that things get going right off the bat as soon as this movie starts. There isn't much build up to the suspense like you find in a lot of other horror movies. Everything happens pretty quickly. Like, in a lot of other horror films, you have like the fake jump scares and the lead up to seeing the killer and finding out that you're being stalked and all that stuff. And this movie just kind of gets right to it within like the first, I'd say 15, 20 minutes. But besides that, like, that's the only good thing I have to say about this movie. Everything else that happens is messy and there's no weight to what's going on the screen. Where the first movie was a play on true horrifying events, and this movie as well, Strangers Prey at Night, claims the same thing. It honestly, at its core, it's an 80s style throwback horror film. The problem with that is that other movies have done that so much better than this movie did. It felt like two different films, and neither of the films were good or original. Where the idea of the strangers' random acts of violence were done by normal people, by the end of this movie, it feels like it's a Michael Myers or Jason film. Horror has come a really long way in the last few years. And, we just saw a horror movie win an Oscar last weekend in Get Out. So movies like this now seem kind of tired and unnecessary to me. So if you're a studio making horror films, especially whichever studio put out Strangers Prey at Night, you got to step your game up, because studios like Blumhouse already have. And this movie was very disappointing. I kind of consider it a waste of my time, and it was a movie that's going to be easily forgotten for sure.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Strangers, the first one, but I hate the fact that they say that it's based on a true story, because it's really not.
No.
Basically, the writer, when he was a kid, I think, there was a person that knocked on his door, and as soon as he answered, he asked him like a random question. He's like, "Oh no, I must have got the wrong address or something." Oh, he asked for somebody that like asked for Aaron or something, and the guy was like, "Oh, I must have the wrong house." And then he leaves, and it turns out those people were robbing people. Like if you answered the door, they just asked for somebody that they knew wasn't going to be there, so they could say that they have the wrong house. And if you didn't answer, they were going to rob your house. And then I guess there was also a news article that he read about somebody getting murdered, and he kind of fused those two things together and wrote a movie. And so when it says inspired by true events or based on true events, technically it's not lying, but it's a pretty long stretch to say that movie's based on true events, because it didn't really happen the way you see it in the movie. And I think that a lot of people are agreeing with your assessment of this movie, that it was rushed, and why do we need a sequel for Strangers 10 years after it came out? And that was kind of my thought, was I forgot that they were even working on this movie, because they've been talking about a sequel to this movie for quite a long time. And it didn't really have much fanfare when it came out. I had forgotten that it was even coming out soon, and once it started getting pretty shitty reviews, I was just like, I considered going to see it, but I decided to pass on it, and it sounds like I made a good choice.
Yeah, I know that you're a pretty big hater of like jump scares, and that you think that that's pretty cheap. So I can already tell you would really dislike this movie, just because that's the route they go with a lot of the horror in it. And by the end of the movie, it just seems so far-fetched, when the whole point of these movies was to be, grounded in some kind of reality. It's just a mess, and I don't really get what they were going for. So I don't remember the name of the director, but it's almost like he wanted to make an 80s throwback horror movie, and this was the only movie that he could make. And so he tries to intertwine it in there, and it just doesn't make sense. So yeah, it was definitely a bummer for sure.
All right. So
what are you into?
I watched something that I honestly didn't think I was going to actually watch when I first saw the trailer for it. It's Derren Brown's The Push, which, if you're not familiar with who Derren Brown is, which I was not familiar with him, I actually had to look up who he was. Apparently, he is a famous British mentalist, and if you're not aware what a mentalist is, basically, they're like mental magicians. Like they basically kind of prey on people's psychology and profiles and stuff like that. And they kind of basically, for the most part, kind of prank people from what I understand. Well, at least Derren Brown kind of just pranks people, and he has a very elaborate way of doing it. And basically the concept for this special, and I don't even want to call it a movie because it's only like an hour and 9 minutes long or something like that. And it's not really a movie. It's not really a TV show. So I'm just going to kind of refer to it as a special. Basically, the concept of this is he's trying to prey on people's like social compliance. He wants to see how far he can push that. And he wants to see that if he can convince people just through like social compliance to murder someone. And the idea is that they have this elaborate prank where they're going to invite this guy who is essentially trying to get his company, I believe he's like an app developer or something, to work for this charity, which they thought was really clever because it's an acronym. A charity, the made up charity, is an acronym and it spells out push. And they tell you that like 100 times in this special, and they must think that they're pretty clever. But I kind of rolled my eyes a couple of times when they said it. But anyways, they essentially throughout the night, they kind of, I mean, it's kind of baby steps. They kind of get him to do things like, I think the first thing that they get him to do was like they had these little, like appetizers, and one of them's vegetarian and one of them isn't. And the vegetarian one, coincidentally, they aren't going to get delivered in time. And so they had him switch it and made him put the sticks in that said that they were vegetarian when they weren't really, like stupid shit like that. And then they kind of lead up to him pushing this guy off this building. And when I first decided to talk about this, I was like, well, should I spoil it? Should I not spoil it? Like, does he do it? But literally when you Google this, they spoil it like immediately. So I'm just going to go for it. And I also don't suggest you guys go see this because it's on Netflix. It's a Netflix special, but it's pretty fucking stupid. It's basically an elaborate prank show, and I did not get it. I mean, it's basically just reality show garbage. Like, I really was kind of intrigued by this show because I do like psychology, and I did want this show to be kind of like, oh, we can trick him into doing this because psychology, this study said that people are more inclined to do this under this or whatever. I like that kind of stuff. And they did some of that early on, but they kind of get away from that towards the end, and basically just reality show garbage. But basically, this guy, Chris, does not do it. He does most of the stuff leading up to it, which is pretty horrible. Like, they basically hide this dead body at one point, and he's okay with it. And they have like this Weekend at Bernie's situation going on where they have the sunglasses and everything. It's pretty ridiculous. And he does all of that, which is pretty horrible. But then when it comes time to actually push this guy off the building, he doesn't. And the big twist, which bugged me that I knew that this was coming before, because I guess all of these articles don't care about spoiling anything. But turns out they tried this experiment on more than other, like 3 other people, and those 3 other people actually pushed him off the building, which obviously he was in a harness and everything. But these people legitimately thought that they were murdering this person. Like, it's such a weird, fucked up thing to do. And the guy just comes out like, hey, gotcha. Like, this is what we were doing. Like, it's a hidden camera show, and we pranked you. Like, Ashton Kutcher was going to run out and yell punked. But it's such a shitty thing to do. Like, these people legitimately think that they murdered somebody for like a couple of minutes. I probably would have kicked the guy in the dick. Like, it was such a weird thing to do, and it wasn't all that interesting to begin with. So I would definitely say skip this one.
It's funny that you brought up punked, because the whole time you were talking about the show, it sounded like Punked with Chris Angel. So
yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what it was, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I just, I don't know. It sounds intriguing. Like, I like those type of, I guess you wouldn't call them magicians. I guess you're right. Like, mentalists. I like the idea of mentalists, and I like, what they're kind of able to do with human psychology and basically all the things you said about enjoying that type of entertainment. But yeah, it's definitely disappointing that this turned out to be more so like a reality TV show type situation where it didn't really make a lot of sense. So yeah, that's a bummer. I'm glad I won't waste my time on it, but I think that there is a good idea there somewhere that somebody could do. It's just a bummer that it wasn't this.
Yeah, and I actually looked it up. A lot of people are liking this, so maybe I'm just in the minority, but I thought it was pretty fucking stupid and just silly because it just wasn't what I wanted it to be. And I mean, reality shows are popular, so I guess that's what people wanted it to be. But I see through a lot of that stuff. And I guess this guy has a reputation of kind of pulling a lot of these stunts and kind of using editing to his advantage. Like, I read an article shortly after watching this that this guy had like a special where he flipped a coin and he guessed that it was going to land tails like 10 straight times. And I guess the story behind that, and he was able to do it, was that he just kept filming until he flipped it 10 times on tails. Like, how is that even impressive? Like, so I really just kind of, I don't know, maybe it was a little bit my interpretation or my review or impression of this special is just kind of tainted by knowing that he's kind of guilty of doing that kind of stuff before. But yeah, it's just, I mean, for me, it was just reality show garbage.
Yeah, man. Bummer.
All right, so our next segment is just plainly called Comics. Tyler and I read a ton of comics each week, and we'd like to spotlight one or two an episode. So what did you read this week?
I read Gideon Falls #1, which is written by Jeff Lemire, and the art is done by Andrea Sorrentino. Simply put, this book follows Father Fred, who is a Catholic priest with a mysterious dark past that's been assigned to Gideon Falls, and a man named Norton, who is unhinged, and his whole thing in this first issue is no joke, that he goes through garbage collecting nails and wood splinters that he believes to be from some trans-dimensional structure called the Black Barn. So,
as one does.
Yeah. While you digest that, I will say that, so like these two storylines never intersect in issue 1, but they do seem to be connected somehow. This book, honestly, it seems more like a project than a comic book. And I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. I just think you should know what you're getting yourself into if you decide to pick this up. When I say project or even like art project, I mean that Lemire and Sorrentino are trying to do something deeper here than tell some linear story. The first issue is definitely a puzzle, and it's a story that was very premeditated by Lemire. At the end of this issue, there's a lengthy afterword by him that details the thought process behind the book, and it kind of details the long road it took to get there. It's basically a project that he's thought about for a long time, and, it asks a lot of questions about various things being connected in future issues. So, if you haven't found out already just by me talking about it, it's a puzzle wrapped in a mystery, and nothing is truly given to us or answered for us in this first issue. I couldn't honestly tell you what the plot will be going forward after finishing issue 1, and while this type of storytelling might be desirable to some readers, it's not for me. Personally, I don't see myself having time for this. It seems like books like this would be easier to digest once all the issues are collected in a graphic novel. So playing this out issue by issue and month by month sounds exhausting to me. And I Googled it, and I read a few reviews about the book before I picked it up, and this comic is being praised by quite a few reviewers, and it's already gone to a second printing as well. But I don't see the appeal of it in issue 1. I forgot to mention that this is an Image book, and, Pat and I have I've talked multiple times, multiple episodes about how much we appreciate and like Image comics. But, this wasn't for me. So Lemire and Sorrentino, they also worked together before on Green Arrow. And then after that, they worked on the Old Man Logan series that started in 2015. Not to be confused with the original one that I had talked about a couple weeks ago, but this seems like something that a passion project for both of them that they really wanted to kind of get off their chest and put out there. But like I said, I don't see the appeal yet. So, maybe further issues are going to connect some dots and, make it better read, a more interesting read at least. But for me, I don't have time or money or patience to find out. Like, I think we've said it before when we've talked about number ones, like you got to capture our attention in that first issue so that we're going to keep coming back and buying month after month. And this series just did not do it for me.
Yeah, that's a bummer. I talked about an Image comic number one last week with The Beef, and I was pretty disappointed. It's one of the worst comics I've read in a long time, and it doesn't seem like you're quite there with this book, but it is very disappointing to hear that 2 weeks in a row, one of us has been disappointed with the Image comic. I'm actually going to talk about an Image comic as well, a number one as well, called Oblivion Song, which is Robert Kirkman's new Image comic, which if you're not familiar with that name, I'm not sure why you're listening to this podcast, because he is king among the nerds recently with his success with the Walking Dead TV show, and he was also the creator of the comic as well. And this is his new project, Oblivion Song, which is getting compared. I've never actually watched the show before. It's definitely on my long queue of things to watch. It's getting compared to The Leftovers, which basically in this comic, and why people are comparing it to that show, is basically one day, and it being the first issue, they haven't really explored what happened and why it happened, but basically one day this new dimension kind of rips open and people get taken to this other dimension. It's basically just like, I don't know how to describe it. It's basically just where they live, except for if like monsters existed. And so there's a way to kind of go into that dimension and rescue people, and they've been doing that for years, and they had like this big project that was well funded to go and get people out of this dimension, but they were finding less and less people every time they went in there, and so basically the project kind of lost its funding, but it still has this small team, and they just found 2 people for the first time in like a couple of years, and so there's a big deal made about that. And it's a pretty interesting concept. I do like a lot of what they're kind of teasing in this book, but kind of what you said with your book, I wasn't really, my attention wasn't captured in this first book. I think that there's a lot of stuff that they're going to try to do in further issues that I think could be interesting. It's definitely going to focus on loss and kind of just like family and stuff like that. And I definitely can relate to that recently. So I would be intrigued on that. And it definitely starts off really well. Like the first couple of pages are really interesting because it's basically just these 2 people running away from this guy. And it's kind of, you're led to believe that this guy is hunting them and is a bad guy, but it turns out, spoiler alert, the guy is actually trying to save them from this dimension, and they narrowly escape this monster that is about to eat them. So it's kind of interesting. It captures your attention, at least for the first couple of pages. But then after that, it's kind of definitely a slow burn. I will stick with it just because it's Robert Kirkman, and there is enough in this book to be intriguing to me, but I'm only going to give them like maybe 1-2 more issues tops. If it keeps going like it went in issue 1, then I'm definitely not sticking with it.
Yeah, Robert Kirkman's obviously gotten to the point where, you just put his name on something and it's going to sell. So I honestly didn't know this book was coming out until you had mentioned it a few days ago, and I'm intrigued. I might pick it up, because obviously you're going to give it another issue or 2 before you drop it. But, yeah, I mean, it sounds somewhat interesting, so I'm not completely turned off to the idea of reading it.
Yeah, for sure, man.
Cool. So you ready for nerd news?
Yeah. What do you got this week?
So this week there was a new trailer, and I'm assuming it was an announcement for Super Smash Brothers on the Nintendo Switch coming in 2018. Did you watch the trailer?
I did not, but I'm pretty excited for the game.
So I'll let you in on my master plan here. So, I was like, oh, Pat's for sure gonna watch this because he's a Super Smash Brother, fanatic. Like, there's no way he won't watch this. So I'm not gonna watch this trailer. And then on the podcast, when I asked him if he watched it and he says, yes, he did, I can throw it in his face and say, well, I didn't watch it. and that didn't really work out for me. But but no, from what I understand, I don't think the trailer shows too much. It just shows some character silhouettes and stuff, and it was more of like an announcement for it coming to the Nintendo Switch this year. I'm assuming it'll probably be fall. I don't think that there's a release date just yet, but obviously any gamer ever has, played Super Smash Brothers at some point or another, and I've never heard anyone say, I don't really like it or anything like that. Like, it's pretty much a universally loved franchise, so it's pretty exciting that it's coming to the Nintendo Switch. I've thrown around the idea of picking up a Nintendo Switch a few times since it was released, and I don't know, this one might push me over the edge to buy one, because I think that it's a game that I'd obviously love to revisit.
Yeah, for sure, man. I am a big fan. My wife and I both love these games, and we'll definitely be getting it and be playing it. And that was kind of one thing last year with E3 that I was a little bit disappointed with Nintendo's presentation, that they didn't mention. Of course, I wanted them to mention Pokemon as well, which from what I understand is coming soon. I don't know if that's part of Nerd News as well, but yeah, apparently Pokemon is coming to Nintendo Switch as well soon. They haven't officially announced that yet, but they kind of teased it a little bit. And Super Smash Brothers was another big one, and we're finally getting it in 2018, so I'm definitely excited about that.
I know we did this as a nerd favorite once, but I honestly forgot what your answer was. Who's your favorite character to play as in Super Smash Brothers?
What is his damn name? King DDD, the big penguin. Yeah. Oh no, I think my official answer was Moon Knight, but you gave me shit about that because he's literally so strong in the game that you're not even allowed to use him in tournaments. I think they've nerfed him since then, but yeah, he's pretty awesome. That character is pretty awesome. But yeah, I like the big penguin as well.
I don't know, man. That doesn't sound like me as being somebody that gives you shit. So I don't know if that happened or not. But I will say, typically when, I ask you these questions, like common courtesy would be to ask me back what my answer is. But since you never fucking do that, because you don't care about me, I'll just go ahead and I'll throw out what, who my favorite character was again. It was Samus. So I always like playing as Samus. Okay.
I mean, I didn't care. That's why I didn't ask.
Well, if anything, I appreciate your honesty, man. Let's see. So, there's been a lot of talk of the Disney streaming service that is going to be released in 2019, and they've been announcing here and there some original projects for that streaming service, and they dropped the bomb for a big one that's coming. They announced it this week, and then that's going to be that there will be a live-action Star Wars TV show, and it's going to be executive produced and written by Jon Favreau. So, I mean, that pretty much gets everyone's money right away. Like, even if that show is bad, like, everybody's going to sign up for the streaming service to see this show, because live action Star Wars shows have been talked about for a long time now, and we're finally getting one, and it has, a pretty great writer attached to it. So hopefully it's good.
Oh yeah, man, I'm pretty psyched about this. I mean, I think Disney has enough properties that they could make a successful streaming service just by the stuff that they already have, but to kind of add a Star Wars live action show, I hope that it doesn't go the way of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., at least from my perspective, 'cause I know a lot of people like that show, but I was never going to see Captain America. We were never going to see Thor in that show. So for me, I really hope that they don't go that route where we're not going to see the big Star Wars characters that we love. But I mean, I'm still obviously intrigued because I like what they're doing with the comic book and kind of expanding the universe. And they could obviously do that really well in a TV show as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's all sorts of pockets of that universe to explore, but hopefully they decide on a fun story to tell for sure. All right. The last piece of nerd news I have for this week concerns, it's actually a good segue into our Jessica Jones review. I guess Kristen Ritter was doing an interview this week and was asked about the Defenders, and she gave some long quote about it, but basically the news piece in there is that she said that she doesn't think that they'll do another season of that show. She said that the plan was always to do one season. And even though she doesn't, say this, it's pretty much implied like, hey, we tried it once. It wasn't good. We're not going to try it again. So I wouldn't anticipate a Defender season 2. Like, if I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up coming to fruition somewhere down the line, but it also makes sense to me that it's not like on the slate of something to do because that show was pretty bad.
I don't know if I would say that it was pretty bad. I mean, I enjoyed it for what it was. It wasn't with the MCU, like Avengers just took everybody by storm. Like, it was crazy how good that was and how well that they put that together. But then Age of Ultron wasn't as good. And I kind of feel like Defenders just didn't do the Avengers did, which was take everybody by storm and really kind of blow the top off everything. But I wouldn't say that it's necessarily bad. I mean, it just wasn't that good.
Well, let's see. Never mind. I can't say it because we have a season of television to review that encompasses that. But I was going to say there have been 8 seasons of these Marvel shows combined on Netflix, and I was going to ask how many of those are good in your opinion, but I guess that would kind of spoil our review, so we can revisit that once we're done reviewing Jessica Jones Season 2, which we can segue into now if you'd like.
All right, so let's get right into it. Like Tyler just mentioned, this is part of the Defenders Marvel universe, and it was created by Melissa Rosenberg, who is most known for her work on Dexter and Twilight, which are 2 things that I did not know that we were going to talk about or kind of relate to one another. Basically, this show, season 2 of Jessica Jones, steps away from the events of Defenders season 1 and focuses on the title character, like Tyler said, is played by Christian Ritter. I couldn't remember how to actually pronounce it because you pronounced it wrong that first time. You got in my head a little bit. As she attempts to settle back into her life as a frequently drunk PI who must investigate a secret medical organization before they find and kill her best friend and sister. So we didn't officially review season 1 of Jessica Jones. I personally have said several times on this podcast that I thought it was a pretty good show for the most part. I think that it was a little bloated. It was about 1 or 2 episodes too long, but I really appreciated what they tried to do in that first season. But honestly, it's not a character that I necessarily am a huge fan of. I do like her interactions with Luke Cage in the comics. They are married currently, and I like their rapport together in the comics. But it's not necessarily a character that I'm a huge fan of, and I kind of honestly forgot that this was even coming out soon.
Yeah, so that was the only show I think that we haven't reviewed, actually. The only season of this universe that we haven't reviewed yet. And I look back on that season of TV pretty fondly. I don't remember specifics, knowing how these shows go. I wouldn't be surprised if after I watched it, I would have agreed that it felt pretty bloated. But when I look back on that show, I think that it did a lot of things right, and that I'd put Kilgrave in probably like top 3 Marvel villains, including the villain seen in the movies. I'm a really big fan of David Tennant and how he played that character and the character's abilities and how that impacted our hero and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of charisma to that first season, and I thought that it kind of carried the torch of Daredevil pretty well, it being the second character to get its own season. So that being said, I wasn't necessarily like counting down the hours to Jessica Jones season 2, but given how I felt about that first season, I was pretty excited for it.
Yeah, and that actually kind of leads me right into what I have to say with broad strokes, so we'll just jump right in. Jessica Jones season 1 was actually my second least favorite of the Defenders seasons, and that's including Defenders the season 1. And I honestly think that is more of a testament to how good I think those shows are than how bad that first season was. Because I would put, obviously, Daredevil season 1 and 2 up there. Like, they're the best for sure. And it kind of switches between the two of them, which one I like more. I do really like Punisher in the second season. So ultimately, I kind of usually give the edge to the second season. And then I think it's Luke Cage, then Defenders, then Jessica Jones, and then like 10 spots are just empty. And then, Iron Fist, cause that show is, fucking hot garbage. Unfortunately, after watching season 2, it felt like season 1 was their one and only good idea. I feel like this show fell into the trap that most like mediocre TV shows and sequels fall into, is they were made more not because they had an interesting story, but to make more money. And I feel that's exactly what happened with season 2 of Jessica Jones. It wasn't made because they had another interesting story. It was made because they want to continue this Marvel Netflix Defenders series stuff.
Yeah. So I don't agree with you on placement. Well, I mean, it's your favorite compared to my favorite. We don't have to agree, but honestly,
no, we have to agree on everything.
We almost always do, which is the sad part. But no, I would say the first 2 seasons of Daredevil and then Jessica Jones for me. Like, that's how much I liked it. Then Luke Cage, then Defenders, and then, like you said, 10, 20, 30 spots down, Iron Fist, because that show was a piece of shit. But that, I think that's a testament to how much I liked that first season of Jessica Jones, and a lot of that was the interactions between that character and Kilgrave. And what we got with Jessica Jones season 2 was definitely not what I wanted. And while that's not a deal breaker, like I mentioned, that first season gave us one of the best Marvel villains ever to be on screen, in my opinion. So, I understand that you had to go a different route with this season, and you didn't want to have a cut and dry big bad like a lot of shows do. However, in trying to tell this personal story for Jessica, what we really get is a convoluted, drawn out, and boring mess. Whenever I finished these 13 episodes, I was like, I feel like I just watched a really cheesy soap opera. Like, I couldn't take, like, the things that happen in this season are really serious, and they cover serious topics, and I'll kind of talk more about that when we get into our story section, but I don't feel like they were done with grace. It just felt really cheesy to me, and just not interesting at all. So just a super boring season of television.
Yeah, and like episodes of the podcast, we break down these reviews into different segments, and Tyler already kind of teased our first segment, which is story. And for me, I mean, obviously this is episode 180 of the podcast, so we've talked about a lot of different types of TV shows on this podcast, and a lot of the shows that we like to talk about and we discuss a lot are kind of like Game of Thrones or, unfortunately, The Walking Dead, that have a lot of different characters on them and have a lot of different character arcs or threads or whatever you want to call them. And probability tells you that you are not going to like all of those characters, and you're not going to like all of those threads in those shows, especially with Game of Thrones, when there's so many characters in that show. You're just not going to like it. Like, for me, the Three-Eye Raven stuff is just really boring, and I don't care about it. But with this show and this season, it's almost easier for me to tell you and quicker for me to tell you the threads that I did like. I hated almost all of the character arcs and the threads in this show. Most notably, Trinity's ALS storyline was absolutely laughable to me in this show. I did not care about it in the least bit. And honestly, there was a point in the show towards the end of the season where she is introduced to this other character, and I'm trying to be vague, not to spoil anything. And I literally turned to my wife and I was like, he's conning her. He's not who he says he is. And yeah, I called it. It was pretty predictable what was going to happen there. And honestly, and we've talked about this before with other things and other movies and TV shows, but you could have easily cut her arc out of this show, this season, and you could have made a 13 episode season, an 8 episode season, and it literally would not have changed anything important at all in this show. Like, it was seriously like this separate thing that was going on at the same time. It really made absolutely no difference whatsoever in this show. So why even have it in there? Like, it bothered me quite a lot. Like, anytime that she was on screen and they were dealing with her disease and stuff like that. Not that this is not an important thing to talk about. I think it is. It just was done in a way that it just felt really disjointed from what we were actually watching with the main characters. It didn't need to be there at all. And I pretty much hated most of Trish's stuff in this show as well. And she's a main character, so it just tells you how much I did not like this season of television when one of the main characters really pissed me off in this season. It just, their priorities with the character just seemed to be a little off, because I did like her kind of justifying why she wanted to be with this particular guy, Griffin, in the show. Basically, you're introduced to this character that she's dating, who is like this wartime journalist, and he always goes into these war zones and reports stuff, and she kind of tells, I can't remember who it was, maybe it was Jessica, that she was telling him basically the only reason that she was with him was because she wanted to be him. And I actually thought that was kind of interesting, but they completely get away from that almost immediately and kind of go into this weird thing where she wants to be Jessica, and it's super, super weird. Basically, it just felt like an excuse for them to tease Hellcat, which just, I don't know. It really, really bugged me. Her relationship with Malcolm felt really, really forced. Literally, Jessica Jones says at one point in one of the episodes, like, oh, by the way, Malcolm has a thing for you. And I thought to myself, well, that's news to me, because nothing with the character that I've seen them interacting with each other would lead you to believe that he has a thing for her at all. It was literally just thrown in there as a plot device for later in the season. It really kind of bugged me because it came out of nowhere, and it felt really, really just completely forced, and it was very, very disappointing. And of course, I'm trying not to spoil anything, and I've kind of treaded on spoiler territory already, so I won't really get into the last little bit of this season, because I do think that people need to see it for themselves. But honestly, this show did not get interesting until about episode 10 of 13. It basically felt like where I said season 1 was about an episode or two too long. It really felt like season 2 was basically a 2-hour movie's worth of material that they stretched out into 13 episodes. It really doesn't get interesting until about episode 10.
So, can I just say ditto? No, I mean, I do have some stuff to say, and, you know, we kind of laugh that we're on the same page so much when we do reviews, and that's probably why we're friends, but, I mean, everything you said is spot on. So, I'm getting tired of saying this, but whenever you do these seasons of television and they're 13 episodes, unfortunately characters make decisions because the plot needs them to, with no regard to whether it makes sense or not. I feel like I'm a broken record, but that's the reality of almost all of these Netflix Marvel shows, even the shows we like Punisher. Like, we complained about how many episodes it was. It consistently boggles my mind why they decide to do it, because it's definitely not for creative decisions. For example, there's a character that comes into play later in the season, named Dale Holiday. And that character is simply there to pad out the story to make it 13 episodes. And while it leads to my favorite episode of the season that I'll talk about later, it isn't necessary. So, putting that aspect of the show aside, I also really didn't like any of the characters this season, similar to what you were saying, Pat. I found myself really honestly not rooting for anyone. Trish becomes some wannabe superhero that will do whatever it takes to get powers. Jessica, to me, has always been hard to root for, as there's nothing appealing about her. And then the new character of Alyssa is a mess, in my opinion. It seems like these characters are developing backwards in the show, and they all are regressing with each episode instead of marching towards independence and being heroic, and that's just not fun to watch. I get it that the show is tackling serious issues like, I don't know, abuse, PTSD, mental illness, addiction, and they're doing that through the lens of, you know, superheroes. and I don't have anything against that by any means. I just don't think that they do it well. Just because you show serious issues in a show doesn't mean that you've told a good story. And that's the problem I have with season 2.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of a, I say this a lot, and I've actually already said it I think in this episode earlier, but to say that this is a slow burn is kind of giving it a little too much credit, because I was watching it and it got to about episode 5 or 6 and I was like, man, this is a slow burn. And then I thought to myself, well, actually, for it to be a slow burn, something actually has to fucking happen. And I was just like, this is really just boring. It's just boring at this point. Luckily, like I said, it picks up later in the season, but it takes way, way too fucking long. And honestly, when you said Dale, when you brought up that character, I was like, I had to think who that even was, because I couldn't even remember, because his character is so forgettable.
Yeah. So while we're still on the subject of story, before we move on, let me ask you this. If we hadn't planned on ever reviewing this for the podcast, similar to season 1, would you have ever finished it, do you think?
All right. So we were talking about this a little bit, before we started recording. You didn't ask me this question particularly, but, I basically just talk to you about how I was watching the show, and that I have to work on Saturdays, and Saturdays are usually pretty slow. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm to like episode 8 or 9. I think I was through episode 9 at the time. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to bring my phone and I'm going to watch Netflix on my phone and try to bust out a couple of these episodes while I was at work. So I got all my work done, and I was kind of just waiting around, kind of babysitting the guard shack, and I was like, I'm going to watch episode 10 real quick. And I got about halfway through and I was like, I'm out. Like, I can't watch this. I would rather do work than watch this show right now. So to answer your question a little bit more directly, no, I probably wouldn't have, which is a shame, because episode 10, about halfway through the episode, is where this season actually starts getting good. But I just hadn't gotten to that point yet. And I was just like, nah, I'm out for a little bit. I need a break with this show. So I probably wouldn't have.
No, I don't think I would have either. I mean, there are good shows that I still haven't finished. And this is not by any means a good show. Like, I guess 50% of it's good because of the first season, but the second season was homework. That's all it was to me, because I knew we were recording it for the podcast. So it was homework. And my wife asked me today, do you think that you would have liked it more had you not had to cram it into a weekend? And no, I wouldn't have liked it more, and I wouldn't have finished it either. So yeah, it was just definitely a bummer.
Yeah, for sure. So what'd you feel about the performances in season 2 of Jessica Jones?
So I don't think Kristen Ritter is a great actress, in my opinion. And I think that, well, we didn't review that first season, but I would have said it back then too. Even though that was a great season of television, in my opinion, I don't think it's because of Kristen Ritter. I think that she's very one note, and she doesn't really have a wide range of emotions. So it's hard for me to root for the character of Jessica Jones. Usually it's the surrounding characters that kind of get my buy-in. And while I like Rachel Taylor as Trish, she just completely goes off the deep end in this season of the show. So, I don't think her performances are bad again, but, it's the character arc that I really didn't like. I will say that Carrie Ann Moss, aka Trinity, is a high point for me. I think that she is a fantastic actress. And, I didn't really care about her ALS storyline too much, but, I did appreciate the character's motives throughout the season. And she did have some moments throughout the season that I really liked. And I think that it helps that I root for her character a little bit, even though her character is kind of a bitch, because I like the actress so much. But for me, the other, there's tons of people that you can call out in a 13 episode season, but the one actress that I want to call out to kind of conclude this is Janet McTeer, who plays Alyssa, and she was pretty good, except when she gets angry. So her character, like, I don't want to spoil anything with it, obviously, but there are points in the season where her character gets really angry, and she has like this anger problem because she's brain damaged, and it's almost laughable when she got really upset. And I mean, I'll leave it at that because we're kind of tiptoeing some spoilers here. But, you know, I thought that she did a good job except for whenever she was expected to be really upset. And then for me, you know, I kind of smirked, which is not a good sign.
Yeah, for sure. And I completely agree with you when it comes to Christian Ritter's acting. It's kind of hard for me, and we've had this discussion before, it's hard for me to tell if it's the material or her acting. And honestly, especially in this season, I don't really remember thinking this when I was watching the first season. I kind of lean towards the material as being the material's fault, because I think as the show got more interesting towards the end of the last little bit, like I said, or I keep saying that it doesn't really get interesting until about halfway through episode 10. I think she got better as the show went along, as the season went along. So I would kind of lean towards the material, but yeah, she's not a good actress by any means. I just think that the material kind of brought her up a little bit. I completely agree with what you said about Carrie Ann Moss. I think she acts her ass off despite the really shitty character arc that she had in this show. And as far as Trish is concerned, I think this is something that I brought up before a couple of times on the podcast. I think there's something to be said about not liking a character and when you're not supposed to like a character. And she does that really well in this season, because I didn't like most of the stuff that she was doing, and you're not really supposed to like most of the stuff that she's doing. So I thought, at least in that sense, Rachel Taylor did a good job. I honestly could count on like one hand the scenes that she was in where she wasn't like on the verge of tears or yelling at somebody, because that was pretty much her two notes in the entire season of television. So that was a little bit frustrating for sure. And I don't know, I think I disliked Janet McTeer's acting a little bit more than you did. I really missed David Tennant in this show quite a lot. I mean, he is in it briefly, not to spoil too much, but he's definitely not the main villain in this show by any means, and I definitely missed him. I thought she was very underwhelming.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, so this is where we talk about the action, but honestly, there's not a ton of action in the show, unfortunately. I mean, even when the show kind of picks up as far as the intensity of the plot, it really doesn't have a ton of action. For me, Jessica Jones hasn't never been one of my favorite characters, for a similar reason why Superman isn't one of my favorite characters, is they're so strong that you kind of almost have like the Superman effect, where when there is action, it's just, oh, I'm going to punch you through a wall, and then you're going to punch me through a wall, and then just rinse and repeat. And you get a little bit of this, especially earlier in the season. But for the most part, there's not a ton of action in this second season of Jessica Jones.
Yeah, I would say this is the least amount of action in any of the Marvel Netflix TV shows, for sure. And I mean, I don't need there to be action for me to enjoy something. Obviously, like, I enjoy a good drama just as much as everybody else, and there's no reason the show can't be that. But I feel like you set a precedent for yourself with that first season, and then of course you set a precedent for yourself with what she does in Defenders, and then you give us this, and instead it's just, you know, convoluted dialogue, and I mentioned it in my broad strokes, a cheesy soap opera with there being no action to kind of relieve you from that side of things. So definitely disappointed that there wasn't more.
For sure. So the next segment is just something that we add when we review TV shows versus movies, obviously, is we pick out a couple of notable episodes that we want to talk about. And for me, and I know Tyler does this as well, I generally will pick out an episode that I liked and an episode that I didn't like. And I want to start off with one, and I use one in quotes because I kind of grouped a lot of them together. I'm going to start off with the one that I didn't like, which is episodes 1 through 9. I just grouped them all into one episode because honestly, I could not tell them apart because they're basically just the same boring bullshit over and over again. There's really nothing to set them apart. Like I said earlier, to say that this is a slow burn is it just kind of disses slow burns everywhere because it was just really, really boring the first 9 episodes, and it really doesn't get going until about halfway through episode 10.
So I singled out one episode in those 1 to 9 that I disliked, and it was episode 4, aka God Help the Hobo. And just so you know, like, I didn't throw AKA in there to be like a pretentious dick. Like, all of these episodes start with AKA. So, this is the episode that I started to lose my patience on. So it was very slow moving, and all aspects of the investigation that are going on in this episode are all way too coincidental. But want to know why the real reason I hated it so much? It's because the episode starts off with the characters explaining how hot it is in New York City and how annoying that is. And fucking Jessica Jones is wearing a leather jacket still.
Yeah.
She's complaining about how hot it is. And then she's walking around with her leather jacket on. And it's just like, it's a little thing. Like, it's not a big deal. Like, her character wears a leather jacket, whatever. But it's just those stupid character decisions that are littered throughout this show that really irked me quite a bit. And that was just one of them where it's like laughing at the screen because of how the dialogue interacted with what was actually going on with the characters. So, it's just a lot of this show didn't make sense, and that was part of it. So call me petty if you want to, but it was something I really, really disliked.
Oh yeah, that episode is for sure annoying. So the episode that I believe we're probably going to have the same episode because I think you teased it a little bit earlier in our review. My favorite episode by far in this season was episode 11, aka 3 Lives and Counting, which is the Kilgrave episode. He's only really in one episode, and the way that they brought him back was really, really cool. Basically, Jessica Jones is really tormented by a decision that she makes the last episode, episode 10. Like I said, it's really where the season starts to pick up a little bit, a lot actually. Nothing happens until about halfway through episode 10. And so episode 11 is basically focusing on her being tormented by that decision. And he is kind of her, I don't even want to say devil on her shoulder because there's no angel there. But yeah, it's really, really interesting how they do it. And it just made me miss his character from season 1 so much because he does everything that Tyler says, in this one episode. He's just perfect, pitch perfect in it.
Yeah. So you called it correctly. This is my favorite episode of the season as well. And at the end of the day, if we were to put this type of episode in any other season of these Marvel Netflix shows, we'd call it a filler episode because not much actually happens in it. And it's kind of a one-off just to, have Kilgrave in an episode as that, somewhat devil on the shoulder, even though, like you said, there's really no angel. But the reason that it's my favorite, whereas it would really annoy me in other seasons, is because it's the only episode where there's actually some charisma, as it features David Tennant. His character being back on the screen and, the witty banter going on between him and Jessica brings life back to the show. And that is what was missing this entire season. Because, obviously, it's void of that. And it was so refreshing and reminded me what this show can be. And then, of course, it only lasts for one episode and you go back to the monotony afterwards. But definitely my favorite episode of the season.
For sure. So are you ready to give this a star rating out of 5 stars?
Sure. So I'm going to give it a 2.5.
Yeah, me too. Like I said, really, really fucking boring until about episode 10. Like I've said like 100 times. So enough was in the last few episodes to kind of give it a higher grade, but I was really looking at like a 1.5 or 2 until about episode 10.
Yeah, it's really disappointing. You and I were talking before we started recording. Like, this has an 85% on Rotten Tomatoes, which just blows my mind. I didn't find any enjoyment watching this show, and I'd really love to have a conversation with somebody who loved it just so I could see their perspective on where the joy was, like where the entertainment value was in this season.
And I think it's important, and we probably should have mentioned this earlier, maybe at the beginning, and that was my bad. I mean, we're both dudes, so obviously we can't relate to a woman superhero as well as other women would be able to. So, I mean, there's that. I mean, I loved Wonder Woman. I absolutely love that movie, but I just can't relate to that because I'm not a woman, so I can't relate to how cool it would be to see that really for the first time. Cause I mean, we're guys, so we've seen superhero movies with other superheroes that are men for years now. So that's not something that I guess we're used to at this point. So for somebody to finally get that, I mean, I can't imagine how cool that would be. So I would say that has to play a little bit of a part in it for sure. Cause you have Wonder Woman and now you have Jessica Jones. Well, I guess you had Jessica Jones. Season 1 came out before Wonder Woman, but I mean, you finally have women superheroes. So I think that's probably plays an important role in that. But I mean, still 85%. I mean, come on. Like the last few episodes are really cool and really well done, but not enough to give it a positive review.
Something cool that we also didn't mention that this season did was that every episode was directed by a woman.
Yeah.
And that's pretty cool. Like, I definitely get what you're saying there. But to me, I don't see the character of Jessica as that heroic.
No.
I don't find her easy to root for. And, you know, maybe it's like you said, maybe it's because we're dudes, but, yeah, I didn't see the entertainment value here.
And maybe that's kind of the point. Like, we've seen male anti-heroes before and we've kind of embraced them. And so finally women have that female anti-hero, I guess, because I wouldn't necessarily say Jessica Jones is necessarily an anti-hero, but like you said, she is kind of hard to root for. And women don't always have to be so cut and dry or black and white. So I think that maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know. Like I'm saying, I'm grasping for straws here because I don't, like you, understand why people like this show as much as they do.
For sure, man.
All right. So we like to cap off each episode with what we call a nerd favorite. I hate the title of the segment, but that's all we came up with when we were starting the podcast. Basically, the idea is that we take turns asking each other a really nerdy question, basically what your favorite, whatever the topic is that particular episode, and we take turns, and it's Tyler's turn this week. So what is nerd favorite this week?
So instead, well, I guess you could kind of put a favorite label on this, but you know, I'm going to try to tie this into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and that, of course, includes Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and all of the Netflix Marvel TV shows. But basically, I want to know who your favorite Marvel character is that has not been done yet in live action on these shows. So the caveat here is that it has to be a character that Marvel owns. So Marvel does not officially own Fox yet. Otherwise, my answer would be something like Galactus, but I can't say that because that's still a Fox property. So, my answer is a character that Marvel does own that we haven't seen, and that is She-Hulk. I think that the idea of She-Hulk on paper is pretty silly. I mean, if we're being realistic here, like, you know, it's Jennifer Walters. She's Bruce Banner's cousin, and she gets exposed to gamma radiation as well, except instead of, you know, suffering the same way that Bruce does, she's basically always green and always super strong and not a monster. She's aware of what's going on, I guess you'd say. And she's also, you know, a lawyer by day and a superhero by night, that kind of stuff. And I think that there's some cool stories you could tell with that. And, you know, she's obviously a very popular character in the comic book. She's been an Avenger, and there's just a wealth of storytelling that you could go with that direction. So I would love to see her either get a Netflix TV show or pop up in a movie at some point, but she's never been discussed as coming to the big screen. So who knows if it will happen anytime soon or not, but I think that she'd be a great character to kind of dive into.
Logistically, I think it would be kind of a hard character to do because filming wise, you would always have to be in makeup and stuff like that. So I don't know that plays any part in it. I mean, these movies. You
mean like Gamora?
TV, yeah. I mean, but she's not necessarily a main character in that. I mean, yeah, she is, I guess.
Yeah.
Point taken, man. Touche.
So who's your character?
Well, I mean, you put that caveat on that it has to be a character that Disney actually owns, because the first character that popped in my head is Neymar, which apparently they don't own. Universal still owns that character. So that would be my first guess, or my first kind of pick. But my second pick would be kind of a lesser known character. He pops up in Spider-Man books from every once in a while. That is Taskmaster. I always kind of thought that he was a really cool character. Basically, the idea behind his powers are that he can basically mimic anybody that he meets. So essentially, he could take on all of the Avengers at once because he could kind of mimic their fighting style and their abilities. And so I think that he would be kind of a cool character to be a big bad in one of these Avengers movies. And so I'm kind of surprised that they haven't been working on him. But like I said, he's kind of a lesser known villain in the Marvel universe. So I think he would be kind of cool, but I don't know if he would be a big budget type of character that they could use just because he's not very well known.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm not honestly incredibly familiar with that character, so that'd definitely be interesting.
For sure. All right, so that's it for episode 180 of the Nerd You're Looking For podcast. As always, we'd appreciate it if you subscribe, rate, review us on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, basically any good podcatcher you use, we're on it. You can also check out our website, thenerdspodcast.com. Comment and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Nerd You're Looking For. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram. They're both at The Nerds Podcast. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Google+. Email us at thenerdyourlooking4@gmail.com. And finally, vote for us for Podcast of the Month at podcastland.com. For Patrick Kuhn,
Tyler Hunt.
we are The Nerd You're Looking For. Take it easy, guys.
Later, guys.